Okay, something interesting that I hope Christians can finally come to realize. Of course, if they do, it's going to totally dismantle their worldview. There's a lot of things that would, but here's something important to understand. The Bible, as Christian uses it, is so different from how the Jewish world uses their Bible. To the Christian, this is a globalist dogma that saves the world in an afterlife. And for the Jewish world, this is a collection of anthems and writings and pieces of information, some of it unfortunately degraded and eroded by Rome itself, who punished the rebels and controlled their schools and teaching in the aftermath of Rome, of the destruction of Jerusalem, but basically a collection of archaic texts and myths and narratives that are used for national discussion and function as a mobile people. So you could think of it as a collection of like what we have in America as documents like the U.S. Constitution and the Federalist Papers, Douglas's writing, and so many other perspectives. When you think about it, there are so many different perspectives that have formed our story as Americans. If we were to pull that together and relate to that for our discussions as we do going forward, that would be a whole different way of using the information than, say, if a foreign globalist empire collected our writings and subverted and inverted the idioms that we used and tried to alter the meaning of the language and create a corpus of literature, which would then be a religious dogma being used to punish any and all who would rebel against this foreign authority's power and completely try to erase and redefine anyone who dared stand up to her message. So the gospel message is, in fact, a satire. And so are Paul's letters. It's an imitation of Homer's writing and his letters that he wrote, which were not actual correspondence. Later on in history, more recent to our times, we have C.S. Lewis writing his satiric letters called the Screw Tape Letters, which are humorous and fun. The humor, of course, in the New Testament satire is actually pretty cruel. This writing is sponsored by Rome. There's one author in particular who had the greatest amount of influence on this corpus, and they used various aliases, one of them being Paul, one of them being Josephus. The literary satiric figure of Jesus, of course, is meant to sometimes represent the author themselves, who viewed themselves in sort of a subversive messianic role, saving people by helping them to submit to Rome's authority. So sometimes it represents the author themselves, and sometimes it represents other rebel leaders who actually suffered the fate of a torturous death. So many messages in it. If you put that in the context of what happened with Rome and how they treated anybody who rose up against their power, really don't mean at all what the church world thinks it does. And if you compare that now to this context as Americans, and think about some of the discussions we have right now about our identity as citizens, people in both parties are not happy with what's happening with the border. It became a platform for the Republican Party in this last election, but I would say that the results of the election showed that both sides had a concern about this. It's interesting then when you look at the idea of circumcision, which is an ancient tribal ritual for marking yourself a part of a tribe. It has nothing to do with saving you in an afterlife. There's no mention of an afterlife anywhere in the Mosaic law, actually. Rabbis have interpreted ideas or allusions to it, but there's no consensus on any idea of that sort in Judaism. Just like there isn't for us as Americans, even though we have the same constitution. And the Torah is a constitution. Basically what it is, a constitutional corpus, which has been amended and interpreted over thousands of years with tons and tons of other documents and books. We have an idea, though, of what we want these documents, or what we want our relationship to these documents to be if we're citizens, right? We don't want to treat these as irrelevant if we're citizens. We don't want to misinterpret them if we're going to be good citizens, supposedly. But at the same time, we demonstrate flexibility because we're also aware as citizens that our understanding develops and changes through time. So that is an important part of being a U.S. citizen as well in relationship to our sacred texts as American citizens. So this is a huge part of defining our citizenship. There needs to be, for any healthy functioning country, an organized manner in which to process naturalization Ancient peoples did it different ways. Different countries and tribes do it different ways to this day. So the idea of a immersion in water, the idea of circumcision, these became symbols and processes of processing naturalization, still are in the Jewish world. The gospel completely turns this into something else, where our independent nationality or sovereignty as some country or people is made completely subservient to this notion of we're all one great big spiritual family, serving Father God, who incidentally at the time of the gospel composition was actually Vespian. The Christian faith is actually simply an ongoing extension of the Roman imperial cult. And so that's why it didn't really start with the Jesus myth, but it became, of course, critical to the propaganda and punishment of the rebels during the first century, even though it begins before that century. So looking at that, realizing that as American citizens, we want to have a process that allows people to enter the country legally and legitimately, and then understanding that the bulk of the people in the Red Party are conservative Christians whose very faith tradition undermines that notion. It's entirely diametrically opposed to it. I mean, what do you hear people in the Red Party really screaming about is the globalism and losing national sovereignty, which I do think is a legitimate concern, but I think it also has to be balanced by other concerns, which is why I see both parties saying something that's important and legitimate, and us just not listening to each other very well. Regardless, the Red Party screams about the dangers of the enemy empires and globalism and whatnot, but their very religious narrative is the propaganda of an ancient globalist empire attempting to stamp out freedom fighters. If you look at Josephus's writing, and this is Paul, it's the same author, different alias. If you look at Josephus, who is like central to Christian theologians and their way of trying to prove the gospel, he hates people who stand up for their freedom. He openly ridicules individuals willing to die for their independence. Does it make sense that that's the ideology that dominates the religious worldview of America? It doesn't, does it? It doesn't make sense. But the church doesn't understand this. The church has been living inside of its own lies for so many centuries of time, making up reasons for why the Jews don't accept their Messiah. And I believed all this. So I used to have my Bible verses ready. Oh, if only the Jews read Isaiah 53. If only. Okay, there's so many layers to how absurd and cruel and just deranged the church arguments are in relationship to the Jews, because again, propaganda from ancient globalist empire aimed at destroying independence and freedom from her taxation and regulation. Oh yeah, the Jews are legalistic. You know, it was considered an insult to Rome to not offer the sacrifices in the temple in Jerusalem. That was an insult to Rome, to Father God, Vespian. Okay? Rome sponsored these sacrifices. You know what else is weird? Whatever was left of Ezra's temple, that was totally removed. And what you have is a Roman-sponsored building from which they conscripted slave labor. Now, it remains a symbol to the Jewish world to this day, of a time when they still occupied their own land. But it is at the same time a symbol of the way that Rome completely inverted, redefined, subverted anything having to do with rebels who opposed her in the Judean and Galilean region. So there, go figure. One of those interesting parts of our story.